Um, yes, so you'll notice that the the title that I've given this presentation is a little bit different. Um, so I titled it "Managing Training Loads and Developing Athletes," and I did it on purpose. And I think you guys will realize why that is as we go through this presentation, because um, the more research I did into this topic, the more it led me to believe that it's really not a multi-sport athlete issue, but more of a training load management issue when you have multiple sports. So I'll be getting into all of that throughout this whole presentation. So some of the things we'll be going through today, what is the purpose? What are we trying to accomplish when we're training young athletes? What's the goal for their training, and what's their long-term goals? We're going to talk a lot about intensification and how personally I think a lot of coaches don't quite understand the intensity or intensification of training and how that can lead to a lot of issues with developing athletes in particular. We're going to talk about some strategies to ensure optimal long-term development. I've looked into a lot of the research around this, and there's a lot of really good recommendations, a lot of really practical stuff that we can take away from that. And then we're going to talk about how could you monitor. So if you want to get a little bit more complicated, you can start to use some monitoring techniques that are really simple, but can help to manage the training loads in any athlete. But we'll see that it could be even more beneficial to measure this in developing athlete and even multi-sport athletes, just to get a handle on what's going on. So the first thing to talk about is, well, what's the training goal? Like, what are we trying to accomplish with these athletes? And when I look at the LTAD, there's a few guides, a few recommendations when you're dealing with athletes that are pretty young. Okay, so there's the learn to train stage. Sorry, it starts off at fundamentals. And the fundamental stage involves participants develop fundamental movement skills in structured and unstructured environments for play. So it's mostly centered around play. It's just making sure that, children are active, they're getting a certain dose of activity. It's a little bit structured, but it's more centered around just having kids move around a lot. And then as they transition to learn to train, there's a lot of integration into, there's some rules, there's some tactics, there's strategy, and there's more skill involved. And then from there, you go to train, and this is where athletes start to specialize. And it's where generally intensity starts to matter. And what we're going to see is that there's a really special age bracket when the transition is really sensitive. And when you go from a kid who's playing a ton of sports, who's just trying to move around a lot, to an athlete that's beginning to be specialized and developing more and more intensity, there's some really interesting transition phases throughout that. And if you don't manage that transition carefully, it's really easy to overload an athlete. And we're gonna look at that a little bit more in detail. Just to talk about here, just what the concept of early specialization is, because it comes up a lot in some of the studies I'm going to talk about a little later. But the definition of early specialization is the participation in intensive training and or competition in organized sports greater than 8 months per year. So training all the time in one sport. Participation in one sport, again, to the exclusion of participating in other sports. So one sport all the time. And this generally involves pre-pubertal children, so children under the age of 12. That's generally what the early specialization terminology is, just so we know we have clear definitions of what that is. It comes up a lot. Now, there's a really critical age in that train to train stage, and it seems to be about 13 to 17 years old. And here's an interesting study that I was able to find that looked at track athletes. And so in track and field, 7% of the top 20 ranked U15 athletes are still in the top 20 10 years later. That's a crazy stat. And one of the issues that they contributed to this was that burnout, injury, and overtraining are major contributors to this issue. They particularly looked at training intensity at 13 and 14 years old, and the amount of high intensity training at 15 and 16 having a really big impact on the likelihood of injury. Young athletes with emerging talent, so you got your all-star, superstar young athlete, they've been shown to be at higher risk of training at a higher intensity throughout a year. So when you think about that, it makes a little bit of sense. You know, parents or coaches, they have a good athlete, they get excited and they just want to train them harder to be even better. And this seems to be a bigger risk in individual sports because there's more of a physiological load, I guess, on the athlete, and this can lead to too much training stress too early. And so we're going to dive into the causes of this. Why this critical age do we start to see all these issues pop up? So really, it really centers around this idea of intensification and understanding what intensity is. And intensity is really your ability to output power. And from the age of 8 and 9 and 10, 11, 12, as we can see in this graph here, athletes and young athletes, their power outputs are increasing. They're increasing at a really rapid rate. You can see the increase in absolute power output from ages 10 to 20 is 6-fold. So there's an insane growth in the ability to generate power. And so this ability to generate power increases the intensity of the activity being done. And when you increase the intensity of the activity being done, the training stress increases as a result. Okay, so now you're going from learn to train phase where you're really, the children can train all day long, or you don't really call it training, they can play all day long. And because playing is at such a low intensity, they can do it in a huge volume. But now when you start to transition, you got soccer practice, you got gymnastics maybe, you have, other sports, you have track and field. That's okay at that young age, but as power starts to rise very rapidly during these ages, it starts to become an issue because now there's an overload of training stimulus that occurs. And if we're not mindful and if we don't look at these overlapping stressors and power outputs and intensities, I think this is where we can get into a lot of trouble. And this is where the literature says that there's a lot of issues with these athletes. So we got to understand what the risk factors are for athletes in general going through this transition period. And it's even more important to understand this when we're dealing with multi-sport athletes. So there's a transition from general to specific, so general play to more specific sport participation. higher levels of competition, just more intensity, more things matter more at that age. The efforts are intensified. So like I said, there's just power output increases tremendously. And then, talent emerges around these ages, right? So you have pressures to perform. And it's exciting to have a talented athlete or a talented child, but the reaction to train them more quicker can have some negative side effects if we don't manage that appropriately. So one of the important things that most coaches should realize, just understanding what the demands of the sport are. Having a really good grasp on training load management, the issues with managing multi-sport athletes during the train-to-train phases, and understanding how intensity and volume affects your system in an athlete system, that's really important. The other thing is understanding what the training load is. So if we look at a sport like basketball, how is it different than a sport like soccer? Soccer is more of an aerobic sport with short burst, high intensity activities, and basketball is more a high intensity sport with a lot of plyometrics, a lot of jumping involved. And so the nature of the sport is going to affect the intensity of that sport. That's also something really important to keep in mind when you're trying to manage all this. And then being aware of multi-sport athletes and the challenges that they face, especially when training becomes more intense. So we do recommend, the LTAD definitely recommends that athletes participate in a lot of sports. But my recommendation when intensity starts to increase is to definitely start to pare that down, to become focused. A multi-sport athlete doesn't need to be in 4 sports at once, right? A multi-sport athlete can be a one sport athlete in consecutive seasons, but just different sports in each season. So there's different ways of being a multi-sport athlete. And so it's important to understand the intensity spectrum, right? So when you're doing a sprint workout, this is going to affect you different than if you do an aerobic workout. Aerobic workouts tend to be a lot easier, a lot lighter, and you can generally do those much more frequently than high intensity maximum effort work. So again, depending on the sport, it's really important to understand, where does this sport fit in within this spectrum? Where do the demands fit in within this spectrum? So I've got some examples here, and so this is a really good example of what a youth sprints program might look like. It's 3 days per week, something probably pretty close to what I've done with a lot of high school athletes that I was coaching a number of years ago. And you can see things are pretty spaced out. You got Sunday, you got an acceleration focus with some plyos, a couple rest days, you got some more acceleration with some plyos, a rest day, and then you have some longer accelerations and some slight max speed work and some plyos, and then a rest day. So things are very well spread out. You got a lot of recovery. The volumes aren't too high. This is a very reasonable sprint program. Now, when you start to think about what the multi-sport athlete might look like, and this is just one other sport put into the mix, you're starting to look at basketball practice, for example, here. The week doesn't look, it's from my perspective, in terms of intensities, the week doesn't look so great anymore. There's way too much stuff in it in terms of high intensity if you want to keep the work truly at a high enough intensity. And when it comes to sprints, for example, this is really important. Now, if it was an endurance athlete, this might be a little bit different. But because basketball has a big overlap with plyos, I would probably completely eliminate plyos from the program that I would be administering. And I would probably reduce the volume on the Sunday workout and probably remove the Wednesday practice completely. You know, you need to make some modifications on the total training load that the athlete's experiencing, not just on what's optimal from a coach's perspective in that sport. So even though I don't think it's the best thing to take volumes away and to reduce workout times, this is just the realities of working and having an athlete do multiple sports. And, you know, until they do focus entirely on one sport, let's say it is track, you know, that's just the way it has to be for that athlete to get the proper recovery and the proper care throughout their career. So here's some really important considerations when you have multi-sport athletes. Avoid overlapping seasons whenever possible. Okay, this is a really easy thing to do. You can still call yourself a multi-sport athlete, but let's say you have a season that's in the fall, and then track seasons in the winter or in the summer, or the spring. You know, you can separate those things with time, and there's no overlap, so you don't have to worry so much about modulating this training load. It's also important, like we just did, to look at the weekly demands of the sport, plan around the high intensity elements. And so intensity I would really define as anything that has really high power outputs or specifically really high anaerobic contributions. And in the endurance realm, those are things, anything above threshold, I would consider to be a high intensity workout. Aerobic power and lactate tolerance, those are all quite high intensities, and I would really try to limit those throughout the week and not have any overlap. It's important to consider recovery days, weeks, and months when you're working with developing athletes. So there should always be a recovery day at least, or multiple throughout the week. Every once in a while, it'd be great to have a recovery week altogether. And then even having recovery months in athletes training is just really important for their overall development. Reduce volumes, that's a no-brainer. The goal is to make sure the athlete is recovering properly throughout all their training, not just to do the training that is planned for everybody else, right? And here's something that's really important to keep in mind. Developing athletes are going to improve with no training at all, just as a function of development. So if you take an athlete in high school, let's say they're 14 or 15 years old, they run whatever 100-meter time or something. At 18 or 19, they're going to be faster, pretty much no matter what. And so there's things that can actually be done to make that worse if intensity is not considered and this loading scheme is not considered. And so that's just something to keep in mind. Even if you did nothing, things would improve physically. So here's some more recommendations that I found in a paper that are really good, and it's about injury prevention in youth sport. They recommended having 1 full day off per week. It's very sensible. Again, avoid overlapping seasons. That's mentioned that. 3 months off a year. So in this particular paper, they recommended that the total amount of off time should be 3 months. It doesn't necessarily need to be 3 months in a row, but they did recommend having full month off periods interspersed throughout a year. They recommended that the organized versus fun training should be less than 2 times. And what that means is if you have 10 hours of organized training, there should be at least 5 hours of fun training. That's something that they've figured out, I guess. Organized sport should be less than age. So again, if you're 10 years old, it should be less than 10 hours a week of organized sport. So if you're 16, it should be less than 16 hours a week of organized sport. That's just a good rule of thumb to follow. And then they also recommended gym plus sport less than 16 hours a week. I can't exactly remember why that number was achieved, but it seems like, again, another good recommendation. Here's another study looking at specialization of youth athletes and how that affects injury. And so they looked at highly specialized athletes, and they found that these athletes were more likely to be injured overall. The athletes who played more than 8 months, again, more likely to be injured. And the athletes that did more training hours per week than their age were more likely to be injured. So again, this is where those recommendations came out of. They're seeing large increases in injuries from essentially too much training or too much specialization. So how do you know if you're doing too much? How do you know if that training load's too much? It's kind of a subjective thing. You can look at what's going on, and I mean, you certainly don't want to do nothing or basically train twice a week. That's not what I'm recommending at all, because at the end of the day, the training is going to be good for young developing athletes, but it's just a matter of being sensible. So using the RPE scale is something that's really simple and valid for quantifying that training load. And all it is the rate of perceived exertion on a scale of, could be 1 to 10. There's other scales, but 1 to 10 is an easy one to use. And then you multiply that by the duration of that activity. So you look at this scale, you say, okay, basketball practice last night, where is that on this scale of RPE? Okay, it was a 5. All right, well, basketball practice was 2 hours long, which is 120 minutes. So 120 minutes times 5, what is that, 700? Did I do that right? 600? And so that's your training load score. So it gives you something that's very general that you're able to compare to other sports. Even you can compare it to track, you can compare it to soccer, you can compare it to hockey. It gives you a universal unit of training load and intensity to measure against. And this is really convenient because you can compare it between athletes, you can compare it within the athlete, and it just gives you really good training metrics. So let's say you do this for a week, you can look at it over the week, and then you can see where your issues might lie, especially with the multi-sport athletes. So if you think about an athlete that's going from, I mean, I've had athletes show up to track practices in high school, and they say, okay, well, they don't tell me, or they forget to tell me, and then, well, I got to go to soccer practice after this. We just did a really hard speed workout or speed endurance workout, and you're just going to go play soccer. So now you're talking about a 4-hour training time, times that by the intensity, like that's a lot. So if you graph that, you'd see a huge spike. You would know, okay, either you could tone down the track practice or you could take the next day off. So it just highlights where those buckets of recovery are more beneficial, and it generally will tell you if things are too much or if you're safe. And it's super simple to do. So here are some general guidelines again from some research. Are there more than 4 sessions above 6? That's something to keep in mind. In this particular study, they noted that anywhere between 2,000 and 4,000 units. So again, if you added up all those units, those RPE times duration units in a week, if that lies between 2,000 and 4,000, it increases the likelihood of an injury with athletes. So again, just keep in mind 1 3-hour session at 6 is 1080. So if you did 2 of those in a week, I mean, that's probably pretty reasonable, but you just got to keep in mind that if you go over 4,000, it starts to become quite a bit. And the really interesting thing is, so you can see on this graph here, there's a couple of lines. So one of them is like preseason, which just means you're probably just doing practices. And then you have 2 stages of competition. And what you notice is as soon as you enter a competitive phase, the sensitivity of a high training load leads to higher injury likelihoods. So when an athlete's in a competitive season of any form, it's especially important to reduce training loads and competitive stressors all around. This is, I mean, the graph's pretty clear. The research is pretty evident about that. So it's definitely something to keep in mind. I've given a particular talk in the past where I look at the training with some athletes that I've coached before. And when stress is high, there's a way higher likelihood of injury, but also decreased performance. And so this is even something to keep in mind when athletes are going through exam periods. It's a really tough time. And so if you have a high school athlete, multi-sport, going through exams, this is a crazy time. So you really got to be mindful of these things and reduce volume. When in doubt, do less, reduce the volume. So this is the last slide before we can have a little discussion, or I'll take any questions. But it's just about strength training. And I really like this infographic because it just makes it so simple. How young is too young? When should you start strength training? So we talked about multi-sport athletes, we talked about specialization, we talked about intensity. But, at what age do you start strength training? Well, in this particular study, they looked at, basically when athletes started strength training and if they had any sport experience or no sport experience. And what they found was that the earlier, the better. And if you include strength and conditioning before adolescence, it increases the performance, or at least the neuromuscular performance, later in life into adulthood. And so this is definitely something I would recommend to developing athletes of any sport, is to get into some form of a strength and conditioning routine. It can be very simple, some sort of resistance training, core training, plyo drills, things of that nature. And include these in an athlete's regime or schedule. Now, if you do, you got to keep in mind there's also an intensity to these activities, and so it does contribute to the training load, and that's definitely something that needs to be factored into the overall equation too. So you're adding another element. It's almost like you're another multi-sport athlete. So there's two sports, and then there's strength and conditioning on top of that. It's a third sport. But the benefits seem to be pretty large, and I believe strength and conditioning and some of those resources can really help athletes be more resilient to injury, and it may actually even increase the threshold, that training load threshold, that they're able to handle. So it may make them more resilient at the end of the day. So it's definitely something that should be factored into training. Okay, well that was kind of the end of the slides. I had a few more in the old presentation that I did of this, but I didn't think they applied here. But I'd love to take any questions, especially if Heather has any. If she's even
calling on me. I guess I'll ask a question on behalf, or hopefully for everybody. But one of the things that I struggle with is when to start in the weight room. There's a lot of conflicting, perhaps outdated old research that kind of poo-poos some of that. So I know we've talked about it, but it might just be a good thing to discuss because that is, supplementing their main sport. And if they are doing multiple sports, like you said, you have to be careful how much training load they're accumulating with
Yeah.
weight room activities. So, is there an age that you typically would recommend, or, level of development?
I guess it depends on resources, and we say strength and conditioning, but that can be a number of different things. But I don't think there is too young. I would think as early as possible. You know, 8 years old, 7, 8. Because at that young, again, if you think about intensity, at those ages, it's more skill development. And as their neuromuscular systems develop and their power outputs, it becomes a different activity. And I think all of that's really beneficial. So yeah, as young as possible. Any other questions, or is there anything else that anybody wants me to cover in a way?
I have another one, but I was going to wait till see if anybody else wanted to jump in.
Yeah, go ahead.
Um, the so I'm noticing a lot of, well, not a lot, but some track athletes coming from sports like gymnastics, which you called out. And I used to be a gymnast and understand the amount of hours definitely do not fall under those thresholds in terms of like hours per week being under your age. Um, so that can get into some dangerous territory. And I think
Yeah,
that sport in general needs a little bit of attention as to how much training they're doing, but it's also difficult because the peak age is a lot younger than a lot of other sports. So dealing with athletes that have either just finished gymnastics or might still be doing gymnastics or have that background coming into track, how can we better, as coaches, how can we better set some of those expectations with parents that you know there's a lot of research into this whole training load intensification, Maybe just some practical ideas there for how to deal with that, because I think that mentality is a little bit difficult to crack through and feel like they're doing enough training for track when they're so used to doing so much training in gymnastics.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting case because that is the early specialization sport. And injuries are sky high in that sport. It's a huge issue. There's things that are going on within the sport, like they're changing the judging system. So I'm seeing it have an effect that's kind of prolonging gymnast's career, and there's a shift towards speed power, which kind of emphasizes more of a strength and conditioning approach, which is helping everything out. But it kind of speaks to the point that during the train to train phase, athletes are going from participation, maximizing participation, to intensification. And if you just maintain your activity as is and intensify it, it's just too much. Like you can't play when you're a kid, like when you're a kid, because the intensity is so low when you become an adolescent, because the intensities get so much higher. And so that it's similar in gymnastics, I guess. I think education's the only way to really help, because training 5 days a week in a highly eccentric, that's the other thing. So gymnastics there's a lot of impact, but they're all on trampolines, they're on soft surfaces. It kind of helps to dull, it kind of helps to smooth out the impact a little bit. And when you start to talk about intensity, there's also impact and eccentric impact. And so you go to a sport like track and field, it's totally different. And if that high school athlete now tries to train sprints for 5 days in a row like they did gymnastics, it's so much more demanding on the body. So it's got to be a conversation with the parents. They've got to understand. If they don't, I mean, they're not gonna, it's not gonna end well. Oh, okay. Hyper Hilts, I see there's a question here. You mentioned 2-to-1 ratio of organized sport to fun. What is meant by fun sport? So fun sport in this study was just playing, unstructured sport or play. So things that you would just do for fun. So it could be, well, it's been a long time since I've done anything for fun, but it could be just playing outside. It could be going for a walk, playing with your friends, just something that's active, but isn't not organized.
Would that also
I'll just turn on
games among friends?
Yeah. Are you gonna say something, Hyper Hills?
Yeah, I started to. I find the problem is in today's sports climate is that kids aren't just out playing with their friends and aren't out organizing their own stuff a lot. Unless a coach or an adult goes and opens up a gym or goes and organizes something for them, they don't go. So I've tried as a coach to just open up free gym for them where they go and just scrim it or whatever, or there's not that intense training, but it is a lot harder than when I was a kid.
Totally. Yeah, that's actually a really great point. I mean, I think unstructured play probably it's reduced or at an all-time low, especially if kids playing video games and being on their tablets or mobile phones or whatever. It's reduced that. So Yeah, I also don't think that's probably not a really hard rule. It's just suggesting that, when possible, doing things that are just for fun is probably a good idea too. Um, and hopefully they're doing that on their own. But yeah, you're right. It is getting harder and harder for kids to initiate that themselves.
A way to initiate that within a practice, though, and I'll use basketball as for an example, is they have recreational games built into it, like King of the Court, and I can't think of them, but soccer's another one where they have World Cup, and they're little play games that the athletes can engage in, but it's not hugely competitive like a game per se, or like a structured practice, but it's a way to take a structured practice and make it unstructured. You know what I mean? Like, and little things like that I see as fun sport instead of the actual structured, although there is someone controlling it to some extent, but at least the athletes are doing sort of a more fun driven based activity instead of drills. That's how I sort of see the fun spot fitting into it as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, there's a whole psychological aspect that I didn't touch on that much, but just the role that competition plays with developing athletes, and if they're just submerged in this competitive environment at all times, that's not fun, and especially at a young age. So if young developing athletes are just, if it's always competitive, and their self-worth is just dependent on that competition, it'll get less and less fun every year, to the point where that athlete's going to hate it and they're going to quit. Or they're just going to burn out. So making sure that a sport is fun at some times, or at least that they're getting some sort of an enjoyment out of some physical activity at some point, is a great idea.
Just to chime in on this, I think it's really important when they're super young to start instilling that, because I know some of the best pole vaulters in the world are the best because they look at training as they're going to play, and it sounds really corny, but there's two male vaulters that I'm thinking about. One of them is Renaud Lavillenie, and he's a French athlete, and he has like a pool in his backyard and a pole vault runway in his backyard, and he vaults into a pool, and that's like a part of his training. So he's created this entire environment of play around his sport, and he's doing it at an elite level. But I think those types of patterns have been kind of instilled in those people at a really young age, and then they're able to take that with them if they do end up performing at a high level in their sport. So I think it's a really important topic.
Mike, sort of a two-part question. One, have you ever worked with a multi-sport athlete who was obviously participating in other sports at the same time as track and field, and their coach of their other sport? Have you experienced their other coaches being cognizant of the overall training load as well, or has it been purely, the onus on you, the track and field coach, to be kind of monitoring this and making adjustments? And then sort of the second part to that, you briefly mentioned education, so on the education piece, where would you feel that kind of needs to take place? Is it at the coaching level, which it somewhat is already, maybe not being followed, but somewhat there is some education that I'm assuming that most coaches are going through on this topic, or is it maybe more so even at the parent level?
Yeah, I mean, those are great questions. I have had experience with athletes, multi-sport athletes, and it's funny. I don't have. I've never had contact with the other coach, so um, I can talk about Matt in high school. He did hockey. I never talked to his hockey coach. Um, I wasn't even really aware that he did hockey that much. Um, but more recently, working with a high school athlete playing basketball, um, it's not on me so much, although I do modify practices all the time. Like if the athlete has a game, for instance, like you're not going to perform well, you're not going to get great intensity out of an athlete after they've played a game. But that athlete, I think it's important for the athlete to recognize these things. So there needs to be a conversation with the athlete around their schedule, and it's really on the athlete to figure it out. The coach places an importance on it. The athlete organizes their schedule. And so with this particular athlete, they talk to the basketball coach. If they have to miss practices, I think that's okay. And so there seems to be an understanding, like a reasonable understanding about practices with some coaches, at least. Now, I don't know if you can miss too many basketball practices if you're on a team. Um, but I think I think most coaches would be reasonable about it. And then coming back to the educational component, absolutely, parents need to be probably the most involved. And again, I put a lot of emphasis on the athlete because, the athlete, we need to put more responsibility. They need to be more responsible for themselves. So I believe in building responsibility into the athlete. And so educating them and having them aware of this is important because, if they're on board, they'll talk with their parents as well. And yeah, parents need to be educated really bad too, because it's if the parent thinks that you're not training them hard enough, then they're gonna take their kids and go somewhere else, and the kid's not going to be any better off because of that. So if parents aren't involved, then it's not helpful.